She was the last person anyone in Moose Jaw expected to see standing in the doorway of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church that Sunday morning, and the silence that fell over the fellowship hall was the kind that had teeth. Harriet Colborne had not asked to come. Her mother-in-law, Doris Wakefield, had made it clear the week before that Harriet's presence at the autumn harvest supper was not optional. "You still carry the Wakefield name," Doris had said, stirring her tea without looking up. "Whatever people think of Owen, you will not embarrass this family by hiding." So Harriet had ironed her only good dress, the pale green one with the mended hem, and she had walked the 6 blocks through the cold Saskatchewan wind, and she had pushed open those heavy doors, and the room had gone quiet the way a pond goes quiet when something large moves beneath the surface. She was 26 years old and had been a widow for 4 months. Owen Wakefield had died in police custody on a Thursday night in June, and by Friday morning the whole town already knew why. He had been arrested the previous evening at the Lakeside Motel on the Trans-Canada, along with 3 men Harriet had never met and never heard of, and a quantity of stolen farm equipment that had been disappearing from ranches across the region for nearly 2 years. The equipment had been traced, the men had talked. Owen, it turned out, had been running the entire operation from the back office of the agricultural supply company where he worked, the one his father had built, the one Harriet had spent 4 years helping him keep afloat. He had died of a heart attack before they could formally charge him. The doctor said it was sudden. The town said it was convenient. Harriet had known nothing. She had signed nothing, touched nothing, understood nothing of what Owen had been doing behind the closed door of that office every Tuesday and Thursday evening when he stayed late. She had believed him when he said the business was struggling. She had clipped grocery coupons and canceled her gym membership and told herself that things would turn around. She had been faithful and careful and completely blind. None of that mattered to Moose Jaw. She found a seat at the far end of the long folding table nearest the door, which suited her fine because she intended to eat quickly, thank Reverend McPhail for the meal, leave her $10 bill in the donation envelope, and disappear before anyone felt compelled to speak to her. She unfolded her paper napkin and reached for the breadbasket. The woman beside her, Lorraine Pratt, the wife of the man who owned the Ford dealership, stood up without a word and moved 4 seats to the left, carrying her plate with her. Harriet set the breadbasket back down. She picked up her fork. She put it down again. The windows along the south wall were fogged from the warmth of the kitchen, and outside the October light was already going gray and thin. She could hear the women at the serving table behind her, the clinking of ladles against serving bowls, the low, deliberate murmur of voices that carried just enough to be heard without being specific enough to be confronted. She caught the word nerve, and then the word shameless, and she fixed her eyes on the far wall, on the framed passage from mica that hung above the unused piano, and she held herself very still. She was just going to get through this. She was just going to survive the next 40 minutes. The side door at the far end of the hall opened with a bang. It wasn't the main entrance. Nobody used that door in October because the weather stripping had been broken since 2019 and the cold came straight through. But it opened now, and the man who came through it brought the cold with him, a hard bite of prairie wind that sent the paper napkins skittering off 3 tables before the door swung shut behind him. Harriet had seen Cade Elroy exactly once before, 2 years ago, when he had come into the co-op hardware store to buy fencing supplies, and she had been behind the counter covering for the regular cashier. She remembered him because he was difficult to forget. He was a large man, ranch-built, the kind of lean that came from actual labor rather than the gym, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been introduced to a fence post more than once. He ran the Elroy property out on Grid Road 631, 43 sections of mixed grain and cattle that his family had farmed for 3 generations without much interest in what the town thought of any of it. He was not a church-going man. Everyone knew that. He stood in the doorway of the fellowship hall in a canvas work jacket, still carrying bits of straw on the sleeves, and he looked at the room the way a man looks at a river he's trying to ford, taking the measure of it, deciding where to step. Reverend MacPhail rose from the head table. "Cade, we weren't expecting you tonight." Cade didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved across the room in a slow, deliberate sweep, taking in the mayor, the reeve, the bank manager, the women from the UCW, the men from the UCW, the men from the Agricultural Society. Then his gaze reached the far end of the table near the door, and it stopped. Harriet looked back at him. She could not help it. He crossed the room in 12 steps. She counted them because she had nothing else to do with her hands, and she needed something to count. He stopped across from her, pulled out the chair that Lorraine Pratt had abandoned, turned it around, and sat down in it backwards with his arms resting across the top rail, facing Harriet with an expression of complete and unconcerned ease. "Evening," he said. She stared at him. Mr. Elroy Cade." He reached across the table and took a dinner roll from the breadbasket and bit into it without ceremony. "You eating?" "I was attempting to." "Then attempt." He looked toward the serving table. "Somebody want to pass down the stew?" Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Lloyd Beaumont, the reeve, who was apparently hungry enough to override his social instincts, passed the serving bowl. Cade ladled stew into Harriet's bowl first, then his own, and set the ladle down. The room around them slowly, reluctantly, resumed its noise. Harriet picked up her fork again. Her hand was steadier than she expected. She looked at the man across from her, this large, weathered stranger who had walked into a room full of hostility and sat down in the middle of it like he was sitting down at his own kitchen table. "You're going to have people talking," she said quietly. "People are already talking." He tore the roll in half. "Been talking about me since I was 19, and told the Ag Society their drainage proposal was idiotic. Made no difference then. Makes no difference now. This is different. Is it?" It wasn't a question. He looked at her steadily, not with pity, which she could not have borne. With something more level than that. "I know a little about having a name that precedes you, Harriet. My grandfather ran a still during the Depression, and the family never fully recovered from the reputation. Took 3 generations to get it back. I'm not inclined to stand at a distance from people who've been handed someone else's mess to carry." She didn't know what to say to that. She looked down at her stew and ate 2 spoonfuls before she trusted herself to speak again. "Thank you," she finally said, very quietly, "for sitting here. I sat here because it was the only seat in the room with decent company," he said, and he meant it so plainly, without performance or charm, that she believed him. She walked home alone in the dark afterward, the cold coming up hard off the flat fields at the edge of town, and she did not understand a single thing that had just happened. The next morning she found a quarter cord of split birch stacked against the side of a rented bungalow on Avenue H. She stood on the front step in her housecoat and her rubber boots, and she looked at it for a long time. It was good wood, properly seasoned, stacked with the cut ends out the way her father had always told her was the right way. Beside it was a burlap bag that turned out to contain 3 dressed rabbits and a mason jar of rendered lard with a piece of masking tape on the lid that said for pastry or frying in handwriting that was careful and unpracticed, the handwriting of someone who did not write often. There was no note. She did not have Cade Elroy's phone number. She did not have any way to reach him. She stood in her kitchen with the jar of lard in her hands, and the kettle not yet on, and the radiator ticking its cold morning tick, and she felt something shift in her chest, something that had been locked in one position for 4 months, moving. She put the kettle on. She fried 2 eggs in a small pat of the lard, and ate them standing at the counter, looking out at the birch stack in the side yard, and she made a decision. She would find a way to thank him properly. She would go out to Grid Road 631, and she would knock on the door of the Elroy farmhouse, and she would say what needed to be said, and leave. That was all. She borrowed her neighbor Bev's truck on Thursday afternoon and drove the 14 kilometers out to the Elroy property in a light, steady October rain. The approach road was long and straight and lined with old poplars that had gone gold, and the farmyard at the end of it was the kind of place that told you immediately that someone was paying attention. The outbuildings were weathered but solid. The equipment was clean and sheltered under a long pole barn, and there were 3 cattle dogs who ran alongside the truck barking with professional commitment but no real alarm. She parked in the yard and was stepping out when the door of the machine shed opened, and Cade came out wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved through his expression too quickly for her to name. "Harriet, the wood," she said, "and the rabbits. I wanted to say thank you, and I wanted to say that you didn't have to do that, and that I'm not sure what I did to deserve any of it, but that I'm grateful." He studied her for a moment. "You came 14 kilometers in the rain to say thank you for firewood." "I did." The corner of his mouth moved. "Come in, I've got coffee on." She should have said no. She said yes. The farmhouse kitchen was exactly what she would have guessed, and nothing like she expected. The table was old and heavy, the kind of table that had seen 4 generations of breakfasts and was not done yet. There was a border collie asleep under it. The window above the sink looked out over the south quarter, the gray gold of the fields running flat to the horizon. And on the counter beside the stove was a stack of library books on crop rotation and a dog-eared copy of a Farley Mowat paperback. She stood in the doorway and took it in and felt, for a reason she could not name, that she might cry. She did not cry. She sat down at the table and he poured the coffee, and they were quiet for a moment, with the rain on the windows and the dog sighing under the table. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. Why did you come to that supper? You don't go to church." Reverend McPhail was surprised to see you. Cade turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'd been hearing things," he said at last, "from men I do business with. Things about what was happening to you in town, what people were saying, how they were treating you at the co-op, at the post office." He set the cup down. "And I was up near the reservoir last spring. Ice was just going out. I found something." Harriet went still. "There's a cut bank on the north side of the reservoir about a kilometer past the Wakefield access road. When the ice went out this year, the melt pushed some things up onto the bank. Machinery parts mostly. But I found something else." He rose and went to the shelf above the wood stove, and he came back and set a small plastic bag on the table in front of her. Inside it was a water-damaged, folded piece of paper. I recognized the letterhead. Harriet's fingers did not want to work properly. She opened the bag and unfolded the paper with great care, smoothing it against the table. It was a sheet of company letterhead from Wakefield Agricultural Supply, and it was a letter dated 14 months before Owen died. She read it twice. Then she read it again. It was addressed to Owen from a man named Ray Bricker, the regional manager for a farm equipment leasing company based in Regina. And it was not a friendly letter. It was a demand. Ray Bricker was telling Owen that he knew what Owen had been doing, that he had known for 6 months, and that Owen's continued participation in the equipment scheme was not optional. He owed Bricker $40,000 from a previous deal gone wrong, and the stolen equipment operation was how he was going to pay it back, whether he liked it or not. If Owen refused, Bricker wrote, certain information about certain financial irregularities at Wakefield Agricultural would find its way to people who would be very interested to see it. Owen hadn't been running the operation. Owen had been trapped in it. Harriet set the letter down. The rain was louder now, or she was simply more aware of it. She was aware of her own breathing, of the dog shifting under the table, of the coffee going cold in front of her. He was being blackmailed, she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, new and heavy and reshaping everything they touched. "That's how it reads to me." Cade's voice was careful. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know a man who was drowning and couldn't say so." Harriet pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. 4 months she had spent believing, in the darkest corner of herself, that the man she had been married to for 4 years had chosen all of this, had chosen the lies, the humiliation, the ruin, had chosen it deliberately. She had been grieving Owen and despising him at the same time, and the two feelings had been tearing her in half. He couldn't tell me, she said. He couldn't tell anyone. If Bricker found out he'd talked, Bricker would have buried him, and buried you. Cade nodded slowly. The men who went down with Owen, they're still doing time in Prince Albert. Bricker walked. He had lawyers. He had a different kind of connection to the whole thing, one that was easier to minimize. He paused. But this letter changes the picture. And the RCMP investigator who handled Owen's case, she's a staff sergeant now out of the Regina detachment. I looked her up. She's not the kind of person who would want to know she got it wrong and do nothing about it. Harriet looked at him, this man she had spoken to for the first time 4 days ago. This man who had driven out to a cut bank in the spring, found a letter in the mud, brought it home, kept it dry, and then walked into a church supper to sit with a woman the whole town had decided to throw away. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't know me." Cade was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table. "My father died owing money to people he shouldn't have borrowed from," he said finally. And the story that got told about him afterward in this town, that story that got told about him afterward in this town, that story was not the true one, and nobody ever said it right. My mother spent 20 years with that. He looked up. "I don't know if this is settable, but I know it's worth trying. And I know I'm not able to find out what happened to my father. But you might still be able to find out what actually happened to Owen." They drove to Regina the following Tuesday. Cade drove because he knew the roads and because neither of them said out loud that Harriet's hands were shaking so badly in the farmyard that she dropped her keys twice. Staff Sergeant Joel Tran was a compact, precise woman in her early 50s who had the habit of listening without expression, and she listened to everything Harriet had to say, and then she read the letter, and then she was quiet for a long time. "We closed this file," she said. "I know," Harriet said. "Reopening it is not simple. I know that too." Joel Tran looked at the letter again. Then she looked at Harriet. Then she picked up her desk phone and dialed an extension without saying anything further. And Harriet understood that something had begun moving that would not stop now until it had gone where it needed to go. They did not speak much on the drive home. The prairie outside the windows was wide and brown and very flat, and the sky was the color of old pewter. "Somewhere past Davidson," Harriet said. "What if it doesn't go anywhere? What if Brooker has lawyers good enough that it doesn't matter?" "It might not go anywhere," Cade said. He didn't soften it. "That's possible. Then Owen's name stays the way it is, and mine does too." "Yeah." She looked out at the fields. "I think I've been spending 4 months trying to survive what people in that town believe about me," she said slowly. "And I don't actually know when I decided their opinion was the thing I needed to save." Cade glanced at her sideways. "When did you decide that? I'm trying to figure it out." She turned her coffee cup in her hands, the gas station one she'd bought in Moose Jaw on the way through. "My mother used to say that the wrong people's voices get loud when you're not listening to your own." She paused. "I'd stopped listening." He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. Outside, a hawk dropped off a power line and tilted low over a stubble field, riding the wind south, and Harriet watched it until it was too small to see. 3 weeks later, Ray Bricker's original lawyers in Regina stopped returning his calls. Joel Tran's investigation had expanded to include financial records that Bricker's leasing company had not expected anyone to look at again. One of the men still serving time in Prince Albert, a man named Gerald Foote, agreed to make a formal statement about the nature of Bricker's role in exchange for a sentence review. Gerald Foote's statement took 8 pages and named names. Owen Wakefield's name was among those named, and in Foote's statement, Owen's role was precisely what the letter had indicated. He had been coerced. He had attempted to document the coercion and had been warned. He had been trying to find a way out when his heart gave out first. Harriet was in Cade's kitchen when Joel Tran called with the preliminary findings. She was shelling dry beans into a bowl while Cade changed a belt on the sweater, and the border collie was asleep under the table again, and the radio was playing something low and old, and her phone rang, and she answered it and listened for 4 minutes without saying a word. When she set the phone on the table, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the old wood. Then she picked up a handful of dried beans and went back to shelling them, slowly, one pod at a time, listening to the small dry sound of each one dropping into the bowl. Cade came in 20 minutes later, pulling off his work gloves. He looked at her face and stopped. Good news or bad news? He wasn't what they said he was, Harriet said. Her voice came out rough. He was trying to get out of it. He was keeping records. Joel thinks he was building toward telling someone. She stopped. He just ran out of time. Cade set his gloves on the counter. He came and sat down across from her at the table, the same position he'd taken at the church supper 4 weeks ago. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't offer any of the things people offer when they don't know what to do with someone else's grief. He simply sat there, solid and quiet, and let her feel what she needed to feel without asking her to manage it for anyone else's comfort. She cried. She hadn't properly cried in 4 months. She had been too angry and too ashamed and too busy surviving to cry, and now she cried until the bowl of beans blurred in front of her, and the border collie woke up and put its head in her lap with deep, professional concern. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She looked at the dog. She looked at Cade. I've been eating your food and borrowing your time for a month, she said. Has that been a hardship for me? He said. Because I haven't noticed it being a hardship. She laughed, which surprised her. It came out broken and a little wild and entirely real. I don't know what this is, she said. I don't know what any of this is. It doesn't have to be anything yet, he said. It can just be what it is. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had driven to a cut bank, found the truth in the mud, kept it dry, and then walked into a room full of people who thought him dangerous, and sat down across from the woman they decided to discard. She thought about what that had required. Not courage exactly, something quieter than courage. A refusal to pretend that what was wrong was acceptable simply because everyone else had decided to accept it. The town is going to hear about all this, she said. When Bricker's case is formally reopened, when Owen's name is cleared. Yeah, people are going to feel foolish. Some will. He reached across the table and straightened the bowl of beans, which had tilted. Some will show up with apologies. Some will act like the last 4 months didn't happen. Most people don't do well with having been wrong. Will you be there? She asked it before she decided to. He looked at her. Where else would I be? The formal exoneration of Owen Wakefield came in February, attached to the indictment of Ray Bricker on charges of extortion, conspiracy, and criminal fraud. The story ran in the Moose Jaw Express on a Wednesday, below the fold on the front page, with a headline that was careful and dry, and said almost nothing about what 4 months of silence had cost the woman whose name appeared in the 3rd paragraph. There were apologies. Lorraine Pratt came to the door of the bungalow on Avenue H with a casserole and red eyes, and said she was sorry in a way that seemed to cost her something real. Reverend McPhail wrote a letter. Doris Wakefield, Owen's mother, called Harriet and talked for 40 minutes about what it meant to know her son had tried to do the right thing, and Harriet listened to all of it and said the true things and left the complicated things for another day. But Harriet was not living on Avenue H by February. She had moved her things out to Grid Road 631 in January, into the farmhouse with the heavy table and the library books, and the border collie who had decided she was part of the household from week 2 and was not interested in reconsidering. She had found, to her considerable surprise, that she was good at things she had never tried before. The morning rounds of the cattle pens, the record-keeping Cade's system badly needed, the particular silence of a farmyard before dawn, when the only sounds of the animals and the wind off the fields and the first birds starting up in the shelter belts. She had not known that silence could feel like space instead of punishment. In March, she drove out to the Wakefield Agricultural Building, which was in the process of being sold as part of the estate settlement, and she stood in the parking lot for a while looking at the sign above the door. Then she got back in her truck and drove home the long way, out past the reservoir where the cut bank had given up its secret in the spring melt, past the long line of poplars along the Elroy Road, and into the farmyard where the cattle dogs came running, and the windows of the house were lit against the gray afternoon. She sat in the truck for a moment before she went in. She thought about the woman who had walked into St. Lina, Andrews in October with her mended hem and her $10 donation envelope, who had sat down at the end of a table in a room full of people who had decided who she was. She thought about what it had taken to sit through that. She thought about what it had taken to sit through that. She thought about what it had taken to survive the months before it. She thought about what Cade had said in the car coming home from Regina, "I know it's worth trying." She thought that was, finally, a reasonable thing to believe about most things. She went inside. The dog met her at the door. The kitchen smelled like the beef stew she'd had on the stove since morning. Cade was at the table with his boots off and a library book open and a cup of tea he'd clearly made in the last 5 minutes, because he always made tea when she was due home, which was a thing she had noticed in November and had been quietly carrying with her ever since. He looked up. "How was it?" "It was fine," she said. She hung up her coat. It was what it was. He nodded once, which meant he understood, and went back to his book. She poured herself a cup of tea from the pot he'd made and sat down across from him at the table, in the same chair she always sat in now, and the stew ticked softly on the stove, and outside the winter fields ran flat and clean all the way to the edge of the sky.